my talk is I'm going to be wrapping it up a little bit of what you've heard over the last day and a half. Some of the information that I'm going to present here, you're going to have seen yesterday or earlier this morning. Just a little bit about me, my background. Several people want to thank the planning committee for inviting me. This has been a treat. It's almost been like a homecoming for me. I've had a lot of past clients in the room, been able to talk to y'all and meet some folks and friends, and so it is a real treat. Just a little my back. I received my master's in animal science way back when, and done quite a few things. Some people might think I've got ADHD or something like that. The one disclaimer, even though I do work for Bohringer Ingelheim and they did give me a paycheck and they did pay my way, this is by far a deep talk. So when we look at ET success factors, I like to put them in three buckets. We have embryos, and we have the recipient herd, and that includes the people that own it, that's the facilities. There's a lot there. As we look at these factors and we look at donor management, has a lot to do with embryo quality, and we want to make sure that we're transferring a high quality product, just like we want to make sure we're sending high quality product and we're putting it in at the right time. So it's absolutely critical that we've got good donor management. We know grades have an impact on embryo performance. We know fresh versus frozen can sometimes have an impact on embryo performance. We've seen an increase in production of in vitro embryos, and they perform differently or can perform differently than in vivo derived embryos, or I'm gonna call in vivo derived embryos, we'll call them conventional. When I talk about conventional, that's where we gave the donor 4 or 5 days of follicle stimulating hormone plus a prostaglandin, and AI her, and 7 days later we collect embryos. So I'm going to reference that as conventional because that's what we used to do, and the IVF is the ones where it's an OPU event. There's a stage effect. Some people feel like stage effect on some frozen conventional embryos, and then there's a stage synchrony, and I'll show a little bit of that on the next slide. As far as a technician, we know that experience matters. We want to get some training. Folks that go to school, they'll go to school for 3 or 4 days and then out into the real world and then apply that experience into the real learning starts. Placement of the embryo, the ipsilateral horn, that's the horn adjacent to the corpus luteum, and the location in that horn that we typically tell people when I'm teaching somebody, I want you to take it about 3 to 4 fingers deep in the free part of that ipsilateral horn. So get to the bifurcation, find that, and then place that embryo another 3 or 4 fingers deep beyond the bifurcation. And then the thawing and loading procedure, a lot of people have their own procedures. I won't necessarily belabor that point. The sheath there in the lower left, I guess the pointer didn't work. Once I started using that as a poly rounded in, and that glides and doesn't have any scratching effect on the endometrium. So once I started using that sheath or that style of sheath, I found an increase in pregnancy rates. This is just some synchrony. If you look at on the left side of that table, those are embryo stages, and on the top part, that's days from standing heat. And so if you look at an embryo stage, which is a morula, you can see that there's a lot of flexibility with that embryo. We start around day 6. That's a more natural environment, and I can even transfer that to a day 8 recip. Stage 5s, I'm gonna work more toward that day 7, but I also have some flexibility to move up. I found that embryos have a bit of upward mobility and not so much downward. Once I get into the blastocyst and expanded, which is stage 6 and 7, then they much prefer an older environments, day 7 to 8 or even 9. And also you can see where I've got up here in the top left, you can see this is also the preferred type of recips for IVF embryos. Speaking of IVF embryos, in vitro embryos are increasing compared to in vivo. You can see here that the red line is the number of conventional embryos, and that's been declining over time relative to the total number of embryos produced, which is this top line. And then the green line is the number of IVF embryos, and that has been increasing. And why is that? By the way, I do want to point out that when we do an OPU event, that is an ovum pickup, oocytes with the ultrasound, that's not a flush. I've had a lot of people tell me they took a cow to a center and had her flushed and then brought her right back home. And I ask questions. Did you give any FSH shots? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Some companies do an FSH prep, some don't. But I asked them, did you AI the cow? Did you wait a week? And no, they just flushed the eggs out and took them to a lab. So that's and the reason that matters is that when somebody calls me and they want me to transfer embryos, I really do want to know, are they conventional or are they in vitro fertilized produced? But some of the reasons why IVF procedures have become more popular is because it increases the number of embryos produced per donor over that time frame. We can flush a cow about every 45 to 50 days, conventional, but I can PU events about every other week. It also increases the number of donors that can be submitted to that process. I could use it in prepubertal heifers. I can use it even in bred cattle. And I have friends that have actually used it in very young heifers that are really pushing that generational interval down low. It has a decreased FSH use. For any of you who bought FSH recently, you know that's very expensive. And so anything we can do to decrease those expenses is good. There is no artificial insemination on site. We can utilize reverse sort or sex semen in the lab, and so there's some opportunities for that. And also I can use one straw of semen over several donors' oocytes. So there's some efficiencies that IVF does provide. So IVF does have a few disadvantages, though. We do see reduced performance of these embryos compared to conventional. We see an increased embryonic and fetal loss, and still we hear reports of some calf abnormalities. That has been historic. We don't see that as much, and we think some of those abnormalities are because of the culture procedure. Some of the things that they're looking at as far as improving overall performance are some culture procedures and some different culture media ingredients. And then we also need to look at the recipient environment that we put that in, because we're putting a compromise. I tell a lot of people, I want you to think about an IVF embryo being somewhat compromised, and we want to make sure that we put that in a supportive environment, make sure those recips are managed correctly so that that uterine fluid, that endometrial fluid that embryo is transferred to, make sure once it's placed in that fluid, we want to make sure that fluid is going to support life up until elongation, and then the implantation 3 weeks later. So let's talk a little about a recipient herd efficiency. Ideally, we want to optimize utilization of every cow in our recip herd, and we want to optimize our pregnancy rates. You know, we know, most of you in here know that some recips accept embryos better than others. And you've got herds of cows that I would venture there. Or I remember transferring to cows that were 10, 11, 12 years of age, and they received an embryo and took an embryo for several years in a row. They were just our rock stars of the recip herd. Some of the philosophies have changed. Are we going to optimize pregnancy? Or are we going to pregnancy rate? Or are we going to optimize pregnancies? And I'll have a little slide next to show a little bit of that philosophy and some of the thought process of what I mean by that. Because at one time we were very selective in the recips that were presented, and we would maybe only use 70 to 80%. But you can see that's very, very inefficient. We want to optimize the number of recips used. At the beginning of the season, those calves are going to be the most valuable of all our production, as well as we get those cows pregnant early on. It reduces the number if we do resync within the herd. And it's a modified approach like using sex semen. Again, we want to utilize those embryos. So if I've got a sync protocol and I'm using heat patches and a GnRH like a fixed time ET protocol, like a fixed time AI protocol also, then I might put embryos in, more valuable embryos, into the cows that did show heat, as evidenced by the rub patches and then maybe put a lower value embryo into the cows that got the GnRH. Because as a rule, we do see a slightly lower performance in those recips. And then I've kind of gone to the point of take a chance. If it feels like some luteal tissue on that ovary, go ahead and put that embryo in. Let it take over. Let it give it a chance to, because there's really no value in carrying embryos over from year to year. I remember having stored embryos for people. We would have a lot of tanks of embryos that were 5, 6 years old that probably would never see the light of day. So potential recips, there's no sense in leaving those recips in the herd, not using them, and leaving the embryos in the tank. So this is just something as far as working through some of the calculations, if you will, and maybe this pointer will work. So let's say I have 100 recips, and this is just a one-time event. I don't know if the pointer shows up or not. So we've got 100 recips, and we utilize 80%. That's not too bad. Get a 65% preg rate on those embryo transfers, which is pretty reasonable. It's in the ballpark of where it ought to be. And then we get 52 pregnancies. Okay. Well, that's 65% of the overall transfers, but we only got 52% of the recips. Well, what about the other 20? Let's say I expand my acceptable range, if you will. I palpate those, and they actually have an enlarged ovary. It feels firm, and so I can actually use 70% of those. I only get a 50%. You can see it's a little bit lower, but I do make 7 more pregnancies. So anyway, using this, my overall recipient efficiency actually was higher by using more embryos. What's the cost on that? So let's say my embryo production costs were $350 an embryo. I pulled that out of thin air. So 14 times the 350, that's 5,900. Whatever transfer fee, again, a number I pulled out of thin air. And so I spent another $6,890 for those extra 14. What's my return? I've got 7 more pregnancies. 7 more pregnancies at whatever your market is for your average embryo transfer pregnant. Again, 9,000 I pulled out of just thin air, just as just something to look at. But you can see here, if I expand the use of my recip herd, I'm almost a 10-to-1 return on investment. And so it's really important, I think, that when we begin to look at that and utilizing our recips really need to develop or deliver an ET calf every year. So what are some of the herd success factors? And y'all have already seen this information. This information is not different than anything you've heard from any of our other speakers. Body condition score targets 5, 6 is slightly better. Days postpartum, when I'm going to synchronize. Now, Dr. Funston challenged us a little bit on that, but on embryo transfer, as a rule, we like to start around day 45. That's a little bit body condition score dependent, of course, because a cow in a good body condition, she's already going to be cycling. 45, so I'm adding 17 days if I'm doing a 7-day cedar protocol, or 24 days if I'm doing a 7+7. People ask me, does it matter? And I said, it appears to matter on a range. I've seen some ranches that no matter what they did a great job. I've seen others that maybe the protocol wasn't the solution to their problem. The synchrony, 7 days, that's going to be anywhere really from 8.5 to 6 days. It's what we use. We want those cattle to be on a positive plane of nutrition. If they are a little thin and gaining weight, those are amazing, amazing recips. Dr. Rosasco commented about diet changes. There were some comments yesterday about diet changes. It was not uncommon, especially in late May, when people were wanting to get in the fields, they would maybe transfer the embryos and then go straight to grass. So sometimes that's a management decision, as long as you understand that those could impact. We are in Nebraska. You can have a 70, 80 degree temperature swing in the course of 2 or 3 weeks. So sometimes we've had blizzards and heat stress. I did have a phone call one day and said, Doc, how important it is to check heat. And I said, well, it's kind of critical. He says, I can't see them because it had been blizzard. Even the black cows were totally white. So it would be better not to try to drive and run over a calf or something. Facilities, low stress handling. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to those cattle and how they react. The protocol, like Dr. Thomas said, follow the protocol, follow that recipe. It's really, really important. Good results can be achieved with most of the protocols. We want to make sure we choose a protocol that best fits management. Sometimes we talk about getting cows pregnant and we forget, all right, that those calves that are on the side of those recips, that was last year's calf crop. We don't want to injure them. That was last year's success. We do not want to cause a problem. I would ask you this question. If a cow does not wean a calf, did reproduction even occur? Okay, this isn't horseshoes. We don't get points for being close. So it's absolutely critical that we not only get her pregnant, but we take care of the calf at her side. So that's very, very important. And we notice that we also know and have seen over time that if that herd, if I get a high percentage of cows respond to the synchronization, that equals a high utilization as well as a high pregnancy rate. Recip management. This has already been discussed with fetal development, but optimal management of recips also improves fetal development. It improves body condition score at calving. That determines calving vigor. All right, that determines colostrum quality. You've already heard these things. I just want to re-emphasize that. That affects calf health. We want these calves that we work so hard to produce, we want these calves to thrive. We want the calves to produce. And it increases postpartum fertility. That target, again, a body condition score 5. When I say it begins at weaning, as you've heard other speakers, this is a year-round event. But what I'm talking about, it begins. So when we have a year-round process, there are events through the production cycle that we can measure our progress. And if we need to make adjustments in our progress, that's the time to do it. One of the times to do that is at pregnancy diagnosis. We can check her body condition. We see what her gestation length is. We know more or less when she's going to calve. And if I need to manage her body condition score, I now know how to do that, and I know how much time I've got to do that. As far as reproductive diseases go, I am a veterinarian. You know you're going to hear about that. The ones that we care about a lot are BVD, IBR, lepto, trick and vibrio, or sexually transmitted diseases of bulls. All right, so we don't typically worry about that in an AI or embryo transfer program, but if we have cleanup bulls, it's best managed by using clean bulls, but we do have vaccines to control that. And we do know that at least historically, even when I was practicing years ago here in Nebraska, we did have trick out in the hills. So disease prevention. We want to reduce exposure and we want to build resistance. First and foremost line of defense is a biosecurity program. It is absolutely critical in herds. If you're doing any embryo work and you've got cooperators, I hope you have a good biosecurity program. So introduction of calves is a risk factor. This is 2025 and we're still talking about BVD. All right, we've been doing that for as long as I've been a veterinarian. Got a quick case report about a herd over in east of here. The owners wanted to get into purebred cattle or expand their purebred herd, so they went to an Angus consignment sale and bought 2 very well-bred heifers and brought them home. And the heifers calved out. They ran with some other cattle. They bred those cattle. And then the following year, they had 31 PI calves. 31 out of 200. Like I said, this is 2025. These things shouldn't be happening. What happened is that one of those heifers in a consignment program had been an only killed program. She had a BVD PI calf she was carrying. It's kind of a Trojan horse. If you had tested her, she would have been negative. But her calf was born, and then it exposed a bunch of other cattle that were also only on a killed vaccination program. And so when I called the owner, or when I called the manager, he answered and said, "Hey doc, this is PI Central." So that's not exactly the kind of ranch you want. So make sure that we're quarantining and testing those cattle using appropriate and effective testing techniques. Building resistance is first and foremost. You've heard nutrition sound like a broken record. And then vaccination is the second tier of a good resistance program. And an effective vaccination program requires modified live vaccines. Unfortunately, because of the fear that has been created about modified lives and fertility, which we're not all convinced that's true, but because of the fear created by modified lives and fertility, a lot of people have actually gone away from using modified lives. If I use a modified live vaccine, it gives me a more rapid response, it gives me a more robust response, and it gives me a more durable response. And that I can stimulate both the acquired as well as, the humoral, as well as cellular mediated immunity. So my immune system's hitting on all 8 cylinders, if you will. Only killed vaccine is a risk factor for disease. It's inadequate protection. The timing and boosting of the vaccines really depends on when my exposure is going to be, and I want to make sure that I've got that vaccine protection ahead. As far as BVD control, vaccines with the Singer strain, Dr. Robert Fulton at Oklahoma State did a study at Noble Foundation, and they found that the vaccines that contained the Singer strain actually provided higher titers. And are there fertility issues with using modified live vaccines? You're looking at a veterinarian that's not as convinced as others, but I don't see a big value of using modified live vaccines necessarily, depending in a synchronization. Let me finish that sentence. In a synchronization protocol, unless these cattle have been adequately set up for that practice. Human risk factors. We don't often talk about the human risk factors, but too busy and in a hurry are risk factors. Okay, and I know everybody here is very, very busy, but we've got too much to do, and maybe the reproductive projects might not receive the adequate attention that they need. And being in a big hurry, sometimes details might suffer. I had a client here in Nebraska when I was working, and they were neighbors with someone, and they talked. And the guy asked me, he says, "Why does old so-and-so get better results than me? What are you doing over there that you're not?" I said, look, I tell my staff, all the variables that are in this, we're not going to be one of them. I'm going to bring my best game, and I want us to bring our best game to every project that we do. So I want that client to bring me their best game, right? So I basically explained what that other person was doing, and he looked at me and said, "Doc, I ain't got time for that. I just gave you the answer." So there you go. So the solution, we need to discuss all the important factors such as, injection administration, feeding, body condition management, maybe not trying to do too many things. We see this in stocker operations in the Southeast a lot of time. So mechanics absolutely are critical. Mechanics matter. So this is important for managers and owners, and including me, if I'm your embryo transfer technician, that we emphasize the importance of these things. It's important that we set goals, but then we need to have some systems in place to make sure those goals are realized. Goals provide direction. They're a little bit like a compass. A system is like a roadmap that can tell me, the compass can tell me where to go. It doesn't necessarily tell me how to get there. The system that's in place makes sure that I consistently reach my goals. We need to educate why each step matters. It's absolutely critical. I have seen times where I've talked to a cowboy at the chute, and they said, "Well, Doc, why is this so? Why are you so adamant about this process?" And I explain it. We're standing there, my hands know what to do. We've been doing this a few thousand times. And I'm visiting with the cowboy. He says, "Oh, okay, I get it." After that, there's no compliance issues. They understand. Understanding leads to more effectiveness, and that's important. So we educate why each step matters. We want to keep useful records. I may not always get records that I run stats on. That stats are important. I'm not saying they're not. But we can at least see trends of improvement in our operation. We want to have a design for success. We want it to be intentional, and we want to make sure we're communicating with our folks why every part of this is important. We don't just wake up that morning and say, "This is what we're going to do." Let's have some communication. Let's have some immediate goals, short-term goals, and long-range goals, and let our staff involved. So earlier this morning, you heard people say that fertility is a year-round event, and this cycle right here illustrates that. Is it a virtuous cycle or is it a vicious cycle? A virtuous cycle, basically, everything builds on the preceding event. And you can see, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend James Clear's Atomic Habits. It's a great book. I use it on audiobooks and I like to listen. But James Clear says, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And every operation has a system. It's either by design or by default. And that is totally up to you. But you can see how this body condition at calving affects whether or not they're cycling postpartum. It determines whether they're fertile. It determines whether they breed early. And then it allows that cow more time before the next breeding season. An off benefit of that is heavier and healthier calves. And heavier and healthy calves matter just as much in a purebred operation as they do in a commercial operation. When we look at hazard analysis, critical control point, we want to discover the obstacles to effective execution. And I put these in 3 buckets. One is the knowledge. Do we know what to do? Have we collected facts? Have we been to a meeting and gotten some good information? Do we have understanding? Do we know why that's important? Does it matter? Well, understanding is gained through careful observation, listening, hearing other folks, curiosity. Why is it this way? Asking questions and avoiding judgment. When we start making judgments, our brain shuts down. It's not as open to opportunities and options. And then wisdom. Have we learned from experience, or do we need to keep repeating that until we finally do get the message? And the ability, learning from experience and the ability to apply knowledge, experience, good judgment, so we know that the cattle industry has a lot of complexities. Can I use some simplicity in my repro program so that I can focus on other things? The chart on the right is from the North Florida, and you can see that over time, what happened? Let me use this. So this was about 2006. And then over time, you see that animals actually got bred quicker and reached a higher pregnancy rate earlier through the utilization of some of the principles that you've heard this morning, as well as estrus synchronization. There's a tremendous amount of technology today. It is exciting, y'all, to be involved in the cattle business right now. There's some neat technologies going on. But we still need to recognize and appreciate the fundamentals. And that is crucial for success. And this really drove home to me one day. I did some work for a friend of mine, actually an old boss, and he had injured his palpating arm, and he asked me if I could go help. And we were up in Toponis, Colorado, okay, way up in the high country, about 8,500 feet perhaps. And in an old town, Toponis was just, it wasn't a town anymore, but there were some old buildings up there and some old rickety animal working facilities. And we were flushing Wagyu cattle, putting embryos into recips that were being managed on summer range in the Rockies. And those guys were getting there. We'd all get there before daylight, and they would unsaddle, or they'd unload their horses, and they'd cinch up and climb aboard, and we'd flush some cows. Well, they walked down to the summer pasture and gathered the cows. They pushed them up the night before, afternoon before, and then they drove them back up. And it took about an hour and a half to drive them from summer pasture up to the working facilities. And I was sitting there, here we are transferring Wagyu embryos, and the owner is getting about $8,500 a carcass, right? And I was thinking to myself, wow, this is really as cool as it gets. Because here we've got tradition, right? Bringing cattle up, sorting, things that people have been doing for hundreds of years, well, not hundreds, but 100 years or more. And then here we had technology, embryo transfer, putting in carcass embryos. And so this is really cool where tradition, harmonized with technology. So the question is, are you designed for success? We've heard about reproductive efficiency, and that's doing things the right way. What about reproductive effectiveness? Are we doing the right things? Are we doing the right things at the right time? And then do we want to build some reproductive momentum? That last one's not my own for sure, but we want reproduction to be almost a passive event where we're monitoring that and we're intervening when necessary. So we want to make sure that that is sustainable, effective, and efficient. Thank you.